First of all, delighted you're here. I'm hoping I'm going to take you through a bit of a thought journey as to ecosystems versus startups and how we can structurally increase the chances of startups, of ecosystem success, but learning from what we have done over the last, say, 2-3 decades for startups. So I have a couple of hats on. As Rochelle said, I'm technical director by Delft Digital in The Hague, second location for Delft. I'm also very heavily involved with a project called 2 Tokens, which is trying to clarify the path towards tokenization in Holland. Separate roles, and be primarily on the Delft an ecosystem aspect I'll be talking about today, but obviously tokenization does play a role in terms of how we enable these new ecosystems. Okay, most startups fail. 90% of startups fail, and there's all kinds of reasons why they fail. If for those who are very fast at maths up here, you'll quickly see that this adds up to more than 100%, because a startup typically fails for multiple reasons. As you look through these items, you'll see an awful lot of them are basically related to product market fit. Sort of that there's simply the thing you're building or the problem you thought existed or the solution you have for it doesn't fit. So that is actually a problem you can structurally try to address and in a systematic way. And also other problems that are up there on that list are actually things that are quite easily avoidable in a startup world, but still 90% of startups fail globally. And it's also even the fact we have all kinds of approaches, methodologies, books that try to help startups on their journey. All of them are very well known. We use them as we go through and we try to help startups. And there's all kinds of incubators which try to basically support the startups on their journeys. Different business models, different drivers. And these are trying to bring together the best talent, all kinds of access to expertise, mentorship, programs, etc. And still, even there, if you take even some of the world-known ones like Y Combinator, an awful lot of startups don't make it. The reason why Delft was originally set up back in 2005, so a long time ago, it was to basically take the technical talent coming out of TU Delft, which is very much technical talent, and they love creating their machines and like the real hardware technology, and then thought people would just want to buy it. Isn't the case. So Delft was established. This is the, if you like, the mothership, the big original location down in Delft. There's like 100 and something startups, more than 1,000 people, to try and help those very technical people with their ideas to take them into things and solutions that the market actually wanted. Important to mention is that we are a non-equity, non-profit startup, which does influence the whole dynamic in the ecosystem. It is a large ecosystem, covering all kinds of startups and all kinds of focus areas. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here. What is important for this discussion, for me personally in my role, is that we founded last year in The Hague our second location, our digital hub, which is fully focused on AI and blockchain startups. It is in partnership with the Hague Gemeente, and I see we have at least one person here from the Hague Gemeente today. And that actually also fits naturally in with sort of a focus that we have in the office around sort of how do we help move society forward, look at the challenges beyond just the particular solution for it that a startup creates, but to the more the structural challenges in society. And that is a little bit of the journey of my thought process, having been involved here now for coming up to 2 years, and also with Odyssey before that, about how we take some of those lessons from that journey and help bring it into the ecosystem world to increase those startup success. Oh, we're honored. Christopher, welcome. Thank you. The term ecosystem is a massively overloaded term. If I walk into some kind of room of people and I say, you know, we're building an ecosystem, oftentimes that is a term that people don't have a shared understanding on. I talked that we're trying to build up the startup ecosystem in The Hague, and that's obviously a very big and amorphous goal, all kinds of actors, all kinds of players. But I try to use a much smaller definition of ecosystem, which is a set of people, entities, or even organisms interacting with some kind of value exchange within a particular context. And it's important to have that defined scope around what an ecosystem is, if you're to have any systematic chance of realizing that ecosystem. Some classic examples that we do see, and you all know, is things like supply chains, where obviously blockchain can play an important role. But if you look at the set of actors on this particular graphic, you'll see there's various different types of actors on it. And those actors will also have different values. There's different things that are important for a shipper or then a consumer or a grower and processor. And it's important as you try to create these ecosystems to try to understand what these different types of values are for these different types of roles that are in the ecosystem. Another classic example, we just heard a wonderful talk from Christopher on self-sovereign identity, is, if you look at a sort of a classic case of creating self-sovereign identity, there's all kinds of roles that have to come together, right, in different ways, in different patterns, but fundamentally there are a set of roles, and those roles then interact to achieve the overall value of the goals of that ecosystem. Okay. Now, I want to do a little bit of comparison of startups versus ecosystems. Okay. The classic approach to startups, is that you find a problem, you identify it, you quantify it, you show that your solution solves the problem. You do it once, twice, many times. Hopefully you get some real market traction. You can find something that's defendable. You try to scale it, you grow, and you're sort of into a whole new, basically, solution in the market within some context. If you look at an ecosystem, it's much, much more complex. There's more players involved. And actually, a startup is basically one piece, potentially, in the ecosystem. Because you could have a startup kind of be some kind of innovation within the kind of the user role or the identity verifying role, etc. But if you look at the set of players in the ecosystem, a startup can play within one aspect of the ecosystem. But the whole set of actors working together is what defines the ecosystem. Okay, so much more complex. And then, again, what even makes it harder is that, yes, there's an ecosystem there, but we're, at the moment, tending to do our startups and even a lot of our ecosystems that we do have in a very centralized way. If you throw in that you're trying to decentralize it and distribute it, then there's no one place where you can control it. It's that much more systematically harder. And my assertion is that I think that if we're trying to create ecosystems, it's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude harder than creating a startup. Okay? Right? But most startups fail. And ecosystems are much harder. Right? Okay. I'd like to get your input for a second. I would like to gather your feedback as what you think are the challenges and the reasons why ecosystems don't make it. Okay, I think there's enough people here who have been around Odyssey events over the last while, and I have a Menti screen. So, yeah? I'm not saying you have to volunteer it now. I'd like to, if anybody, I saw lots of smartphones out already. Super eager, thank you, great, go. So if you take your smartphone out and just go to menti.com, there's a code up in the top corner up there. And if you basically type in for yourself why you think ecosystems don't make it, then we should start seeing some answers going by. Trust, yeah. Missing critical mass, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Okay, I'll give it another about 60 seconds. Yeah, ownership, yeah.
While this is happening, can I ask, I've not used Menti before.
Yeah.
Is it possible to see on my phone what's being...
There might be, actually. I don't know enough about Menti. I'm not an expert on it. Okay. If anybody wants to have these, I'm happy to share them afterwards. I'm sure we can facilitate it. Okay, because I think it is an interesting set of lists that comes up, because it is a very ecosystem-focused audience. Okay. This is a super set of lists coming up, and I think people can keep going for a while if I look at it. Does anybody want to elaborate on what they've put up? Any volunteers, Christopher?
Yeah, so I added high cost or other barriers to participating or fully participating. So that can be everything from you have to have patents to be able to play a patent game ecosystem. You have to have a degree. You have to, you're disadvantaged if you're not spending, a full-time engineer doing standards work, which doesn't directly benefit you, but keeps other people from blocking it.
So it's making, in some sense, making sure you have the right resources to actually pull the ecosystem together.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Anybody else?
Different motivations, companies or stakeholders, they'll have different levels of power.
Mm-hmm.
They'll try to elaborate themselves in this ecosystem.
Okay, so different types of players and roles in the ecosystem will have different drivers. And we'll be coming back to that as later on in this presentation. Cool, yeah.
Assuming that there is a market and that the market is limited and scarce, not infinite, balancing altruism with competition and making sure that all participants are properly balancing their intentions.
So again, if I'm listening to it, it's like the actors and their drivers, and some are extrinsically motivated, some are intrinsically motivated, and making sure that set of drivers together come into a balanced ecosystem.
Yeah. Like
Cool.
if the market is limited, then you have to make sure they can support each other without.
Mm-hmm. Right. You have to make sure that the set of parties together, and again, it comes back to that startup visual. You're solving in a particular startup world a problem, a solution. It's self-contained. If you got multiple nodes going on, how do you ensure that between all those different nodes you end up with an equilibrium that is worth having? Cool. Yeah. All right. Last one. Somebody new, maybe. Yeah. Fair. Timing. Yeah. 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 You have to make sure, all your prerequisites, any assumptions you need potentially to validate it, you have to make sure that they are in place for what you need. Cool. Okay, cool. It's an awesome list. And as I said, I think we can make sure that we capture it and we share it. I have a few ideas myself, some of the themes I see. So I'll go into just very briefly because I think a lot of them are captured in the wider Menti one up here. And the list is still coming in. It's we'll check it this evening and see how many more are still there. Okay. So thank you very much for that. And I put this image up deliberately because if you look over the last 2-3 years, there's been a huge amount of hype around blockchain and new ways of trust and new ways of designing society, and we got all the money flowing in ICOs, etc. And despite there being some incredibly capable people trying to realize these new ways of collaborating, and I look very specifically at the Ocean Protocol guys and that kind of caliber who are doing awesome work, it's still a really, really hard problem. Right? And these are some very, very of the smartest guys around, and driven, really intrinsically driven to drive and solve a real problem, purpose-driven. One of the key ones I always come back to a little bit is that it is a lot about shared understanding. If you're trying to look at a whole ecosystem, a little bit what you're saying, there's different types of people in there. They all have different drivers. This is a very good book. I don't know if how many people here are familiar with it. Sherman Fushnick here, Token Economy. And she, and together, also very strong collaboration with Michael Zagram, who's also presenting at the moment. They very much try to elaborate the different types of disciplines that have to come together to create a whole ecosystem. Because you're not just designing within a particular problem, you're designing with a whole set of parties coming together. And historically, when we're trying to solve a problem, it's very much in a centralized way. Even things like identity nowadays are very much centralized. As you start moving towards a decentralized approach to actually collaborating and bringing people together, then you have to also make sure you can fit all these different aspects of knowledge that are needed into one person's head. And with a startup team, maybe you have 2-3 founders, and together they have the right set of skills to realize it. You try to put this set of disciplines in a decentralized way with all different types of perspectives and actions and roles. That's a lot to fit into somebody's head. Okay? But it's very, very important to still drive towards that shared understanding. Ultimately, when you talk about ecosystem, you're talking about change. This is people. This is new ways of interacting. For those who were at Odyssey Polaris, Otto Scharmer gave a wonderful talk. Theory U is a very popular framework at the moment. You basically somehow have to bring people together on the journey to go from the old reality into the new reality. And often those that change, the new ways of collaborating that we're envisioning with ecosystems, impacts very established identities, power, politics, livelihoods. So you really have to think through what is the change that's impacted, that's implied by the new way we are talking about designing these ecosystems. It's all well and good sitting maybe in our roles to design new ways of collaborating, but we have to work through what it's going to take and who are going to be impacted by those changes, and really take that as a first-class concept, because if we don't take the people along the journey, they're not going to go on the journey. Funding is another big one. Uber, classic venture capital backed startup. Highly centralized. You want to take a taxi, you jump in a taxi, they take a cut off that taxi fare. And for an investor, that's a very strong proposition. They can get a capture position in the market, they can turn whatever money they put in, get some very fancy return on it. But is the capture position in that ecosystem, because it is an ecosystem of their actors, but a centralized ecosystem that allows them to get investors in to drive that return. If we start going towards a decentralized ecosystem or centralized ecosystem as a whole, or even a decentralized ecosystem, then it's much harder typically to get a capture position. The value in a lot of these new ecosystems we're envisaging goes towards the participants in the ecosystem as opposed to somebody who has managed to take a capture position or a rent-seeking position. So that makes it harder to get, if you like, the classic venture capital funding model to work, but it does open all kinds of opportunities, and I come back to that as well in a bit. And last but not least, touching back to my first or one of my first slides, there's not a huge body of knowledge. There's not all kinds of proven use cases of how we have systematically designed whole new digital ecosystems, and we have to develop that. Okay. It's a learning journey. We have to go in together. There's a wonderful community here in Odyssey and in certain areas of the world. I think the Hague has an important role there as well. And we have to try and build up these deep capabilities and knowledge. So we have people who have done it, who've looked at the challenges of building an ecosystem from all these different perspectives and brought it together. Okay, so, my assertion is building a new ecosystem is complex. And if you take the analogy, if you're trying to climb Mount Everest, it's a long journey, it's hard. You wouldn't dream of setting out in it with having a real thorough, thought-through plan, making sure you have the resources, the right gear, the equipment, and everything. And, to my view, a lot of our current ecosystem activities is like we're setting off with a day pack. We're just going to try it. Off we go, up the path. For me, it's important as we try to create these ecosystems that we try to bring into the full picture the complexity that's inherent in creating ecosystems and make sure we understand the full scope of the journey we're going on, potentially in a milestone-based way, but that we are very clear that there's a very big challenge ahead of us to create that new ecosystem. It's non-trivial. I mean, you try to envision all kinds of new ways of doing self-sovereign identity over the years. It's a huge problem. There's such a huge implied change. Even with the support of the government as is sitting beside you, it still is really hard to get that push going through. That's in a centralized control, but try to decentralize, right? So we have to make sure we're aware of the scope and the challenges ahead of us when we're trying to create these ecosystems. Okay? Pardon? Yeah, then you're not really going on the journey. It'd be nice though. Yeah, no, yeah. Okay. Okay, so I want to flip it around a little bit. So ecosystems hard, most startups fail, etc. So what can we learn from the startup world? Right? We're doing it for so long and in such an established way of doing it. Now, if I look at the Delft startup incubator, where I'm a part of, we try to look at the startup needs in a holistic fashion. One of the core things we give is, beside a place to sit, we give all kinds of programs where we try to help the teams, the startups, systematically look through their challenges as part of a cohort and as part of a structured learning environment to, address gaps in their knowledge, learn with each other, etc. And we have different programs for different parts of the startup's life cycle. Right? It's a clear thing we can give them. We have a solution called Yes Funded, which helps startups understand how they can get access to the resources they need before they set off on that journey. Because a startup is still a tough journey, right? It may not be as hard as an ecosystem, and there's a world of private and public capital and different ways of getting money and patterns of doing it. They need guidance on it. There's a huge ecosystem, people who understand different aspects of how to help a startup on its way, from the legal to the financial. There's investors, there's field labs, there's government partners, there's research labs, whatever. There's lots of things that come together to give a startup all the things they should need. And there's, yes, talents. Startups need people. They need right people at the right time in their life cycle. But you can take that holistic view of what a startup needs, as well as a location, and I think we can apply that within the ecosystem context. And that's my assertion. We can go meta on a lot of the startup concepts into the ecosystem world, and we need to do it. Okay, so if we're designing an ecosystem incubator version 1.0, programs I think are a very straightforward one we can do. Right? We can bring, people are going on a hard journey. We can put them into some kind of cohort-based program on a sort of short-ish but intense period. Feed them knowledge, give them a chance to learn from each other, couple them into a wider ecosystem, but really help them in some kind of structure to work through the challenges and validate the assumptions inherent in that ecosystem they're trying to build. Resources. Things like tokenization certainly plays a part in allowing much more creative and innovative ways of realizing ecosystems. Right? So one example, there's a couple examples that I've seen from my time in Delft over the last year. One is we see somebody from Circularize here, is whereby instead of the classic model of build something, sell it, you try to get your first target customers to pay you to build something, and then they get value usage out of using the network. And the startup is great. They maybe get less return ultimately, but they also have less risk. Or a similar one in a scientific publishing process. Instead of building a better publish review approach, you sort of get the universities to help the process, help you fund the protocol to exchange knowledge. And then again, the startup has lower risk, but also low reward, but also lower risk, because they get a privileged position. So I think in the world of resources, we're going to have to do an awful lot to innovative ways to bootstrap the ecosystems and digital tokens. And a token to me is a representation of value. The fact that we can digitalize value means we can do because it's so low friction, we can look at all kinds of innovative ways for exchanging value. Okay, community, right? Odyssey already has a very strong community focused on new ecosystems, right? But there's also an awful lot of different types of communities that are needed around deep expertise, around field labs, particular types of people who want to help fund maybe different ecosystems for particular reasons. And of course, we need to have talents. We need to have people from various institutions who both have the drive and the deep knowledge needed to try and attack all the different areas that are inherent in being able to create ecosystems. And so it's wonderful to see what Jordi and the team here are doing at Hague Hogeschool. I know some very interesting groups also at TU Delft, but we need to somehow bring those together. And we see some places starting to do it. I mentioned Sherman earlier. What they're doing in Vienna is very cool with the Cryptonomic Research Institute. Berlin has a lot of good activities going on. So how do we get that deep body of knowledge in some key centers, that critical mass, to allow people to have the knowledge needed to pull the ecosystem together? Okay. I'm going to dive a little bit into the topic of programs, and I have a particular exercise I'm going to go through in a second. One of the programs we do a lot, and I see some people in here who have been in the program, we run what we call a validation lab. And it's in a pretty intense program over 10 weeks. It's at least 2-3 days a week for 2 people. And during the program, we try to first build up trust within the cohort, and then all kinds of systematic peer-to-peer learnings, as well as workshops along the way. Very much focused on helping increase the chance of the startup succeeding, right? We're non-equity. We cannot tell the startup which way to go. We can just help. We can help say, yeah, really you should go left here instead of right, or maybe you want to take that hill as opposed to that hill. Yeah, we get different ways of doing it. And the program has various phases to it, a boot camp and a program phase. And it covers all kinds of topics. I'm not going to go into them here, and I've blurred out all kinds of text. But the point is, there's all kinds of things that are covered during the validation program in a systematic way to try and inject the knowledge and to try and force the startup to look at their situation, their problem, product market fit from multiple different angles, from a diversity of views in a challenged environment where they get pushed. Okay? And my assertion is we can do something very, very similar in the ecosystem context. Right? That kind of cohort, co-learning environment has to have value when you're trying to create ecosystems, particularly given the lack of systematic knowledge about creating ecosystems out there, at least that I'm aware of. So what I've done is I have picked a couple of elements from the validation, like, if you like, curricula, which are very much focused on coming towards a shared understandings, the ones in red up there. That's really, again, comes back to, you're going to have a lot of actors, a lot of roles who are trying to come together. People have to be able to somehow, despite there are different perspectives and roles, have to have some common view on what they're doing, so they can align their activities in whatever way that makes sense. Classic one from a startup world is, you have problem solutions, etc. But when you turn to ecosystems, it's really, really critical, which is basically the comment you made, you have to understand the actors. Who are the roles that are active in the ecosystem? Right? How are they going to be impacted, and what are the values that drive them? Okay? And I use the term value here in the broadest possible sense. I'm not just talking about money or securities or anything like that. I'm talking about everything. It can be, access to services, intrinsically friendship, access to, freedom, value in the broader sense. One of the analogies I like to use is, so I'm a father, I've got a couple of kids, I feed my kids at night. I'm also a biochemical organism. When I feed my kids, I feel happy and good. There's the programming in my body is driving with some endorphins in my brain to make me feel good about feeding my kids, right? So there's all kinds of drivers, from the very explicit to the implicit, that do shape the ecosystem and how people collaborate. And it's really critical that if you're trying to work that ecosystem and understand it and create it, that you understand all the actors, how are they going to be impacted, what values drive them, implicitly, observable, inobservable, reciprocal, non-reciprocal, immediate, asynchronous, etc., and how those interactions are going to play out. Because it's a very complex system, and you won't get it right. Let's be clear about that. But it's like, what's the one from Winston Churchill? Before you go into battle, planning is essential, but once you're in the battle, the planning is useless, right? But you have to do it. Okay. And as you go through this process of looking at the actors and the roles and their values, do challenge yourself. What are the assumptions that you have? Right. What are the risks that you have? What are the most vulnerable points on your ecosystems? Yeah. Why do you have to do it? Oh no, so Winston Churchill has a famous quote that before you go, planning is essential, but once you go into battle, the plan is useless. The act of planning surfaces up all kinds of dependencies and deeper understanding in terms of the play field you're going into, so that when you're in the battle, you have those insights and those understanding of dependencies to actually be able to make your decisions in the moment. Yeah, so good question. Thank you for that. Yeah. So as you're looking at the set of actors and their value exchanges, what are the assumptions you have? What are the most riskiest things that you need to be de-risking? And can you quantify your assumptions? Can you go out and do yes-no testing some other way to validate whether it is true or false, or get some other data to help you make a clear choice in what you're doing? And for the startups, it's straightforward enough. It's a very simple one here. It's looking at, simple software as a service. You want a service, you pay some money, both parties are happy, we're done, interaction is complete. If you take a more complex startup, which is one called Quirky, where essentially it's a service where you can put your, you can submit ideas. If there's a lot of people who want to work out the ideas, then you can, it's enough people want to buy it, then the product goes in to get produced, and then essentially somebody buys the product. But noticeably is that there's a organization in the middle, has a capture position, is taking 30% of various revenue streams, and it's coordinating and making sure that whole, because it is an ecosystem, but they have a capture position and a centralized position of control. So it's still overseeable. It's like it's multiple one-on-one relationships. Okay. Now, it's centralized. It is very centralized. Now, if we're trying to model ecosystem value, this is the Bitcoin ecosystem. All right. A little bit more complex, right? How many different roles can we see up there already? 10? And a lot of these roles probably even have sub-roles below them. Right? There's not just one type of miner. For those of us who have mining, who have Bitcoin nodes at home, right? They're also a miner, but it's a very different type of role. So even though there's just one box up here for miners, there's probably multiple different types of miners, and they have different drivers. Some are commercial, some are intrinsic. There's different people using Bitcoin for different purposes. Some of them want to use it because they believe it's a store of value. Some maybe want to do things that maybe the government doesn't approve of, whatever. But there's different, already even this fairly simple diagram, 10 different roles, multiple sub-roles, many different types of drivers. Okay, yeah.
How do you draw the boundaries?
That's, I think, going to be an art, right? I think in terms of making sure, but it is very, very critical to be explicit as to where the boundary is. And the bigger you take it, and the more, if you like, actor types you take into it. Obviously, it's a factorial game. So, 2 factorial, 3 factorial, it's a non-linear explosion of combinations that are possible. Oh yeah, no, indeed. So you can go on and on and on. Ultimately, we are a world of ecosystems interacting with each other. Right, and I got a hard question at the back now, obviously.
I was trying to respond to that as well. I think in ecosystem there is permeable boundaries. Thinking in boundaries, your ecosystem is I think, pretty. Evolve and
Yeah.
change.
Yeah, so no ecosystem stands alone, right? It's always interacting with other elements of it. But be understanding and try to constrain the scope in some way and understand to some sense what those interactions with the outside ones are is important. Christopher.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you teach like Ostrom Commons and
Elinor Ostrom. And I'll come back to it in a bit, this is sort of a view where I believe we need to take basic ecosystem incubation. I'm personally reading, I have her book in the bag, Elinor Ostrom's work. Very familiar with it, I think it has a lot of potential. I think it's where we basically have to go.
so direct to this slide, the first one is boundaries,
Mhm.
which we just talked
Yeah.
about. But the 8th principle is subsidiarity,
Mhm.
which is how do you have at the lowest possible level the authority rather than having it
Yeah.
to levels where they don't have sufficient information to do the work.
Yeah, but that's the classic sort of public, at a distance governance model. Yeah, no, and her work, for those who don't know, Elinor Ostrom, she won the Nobel Peace Prize, I think, in 92. She died 2009. That's right, sorry, but they published one of her seminal works in 92. And she died, I think, 4 years ago. Very, very readable book. Actually, I didn't see this question, actually. Yeah, there we go. So, and she raises some very important points about there's alternatives out there than the classic privatization model or the public good model that we can do different ways with much more closer oversight of the use of the common pool resources than maybe we do in other approaches. So an ecosystem is a set of actors exchanging value within some context, and it's important to define what that context is. Okay, and importantly, if you look at the set of roles and set of values, etc., it's a lot to hold in one head. Okay? If you're trying to really understand it and be able to slice it and dice it, it's a lot to have in one person's head. Okay, I want to go into an exercise. Okay, it's quite a straightforward one, but before I do that, I want to give a little bit of context. I touched earlier about types of value. Okay, there's many different types of value, be it monetary, be it housing, securities, whatever. It can be access to resources we often take for granted, clean air, water, electricity, etc. It can be in more softer ones, be it friendship, trust. It can be service we want action, or if, taking the example from Christopher's talk earlier, freedom. We didn't take it for granted. We didn't design to protect it. And then at some point, the boundaries around us changed and it was gone. So, or very much constrained. So many different types of value. So what I'd like to do is a short exercise. We have some post-it notes, I believe, Rochelle. So I'll pass them around. As she does that, maybe I'll just give a bit of context. I'd like you to try to get into basically groups of 3. 2 is also okay. It doesn't have to be 3. I see some natural ones. Some of you will have to move or cuddle up, whatever way you want to do it. And I'd like you to pick one challenge between the two of you that you agree on, right? That is an important one for you. And then individually, just each person apart, write down some of the key roles that are active in that ecosystem. I'd like you after that to come back and just discuss it. just like it's 2 minutes for that. And then look at what are the key value drivers for those roles in the ecosystem. Again, take a couple minutes for that and a couple minutes to come back and discuss it. We probably will be going a little bit over time, given it's now 10 past, but I think it's important to get a flavor. And what I'm hoping to stimulate with this is that you take your different points of views as to what are the roles and what are the values, and understand that there's many different ways of doing it. It's an exercise I've run in a few different contexts, and I find it a very powerful way. So let's get going. Pick your ecosystem. All right. I'm going to have to, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to park the discussions a little bit. But, you know, you all will be going to lunch after this talk. I don't want to hold too much between you and lunch. But I do encourage you to please try and work through the exercise more over lunch, right? Because it is, one that you have to line on if you want to take this further. Okay? I'm going to go on in the interest of time. Right. Huh? Well, we're going to have to. Maybe I need to. I've triggered a whole discussion. All right, guys, we're going to have to go on with the slides. Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, I think I underestimated the energy it triggered, actually, which is interesting. There's a lot of energy in the discussion because as soon as you start exploring what are the roles and what are the values, you very quickly find that people have different views as to what are the roles and what are the values that's being exchanged, especially when you take it away from being explicit value. An awful lot of the exchanges we do as humans are implicit values. We do it because we want to do it, right? Or because it gives us some internal feeling of good. And a lot of our, if you like, classic, value stream mappings like we do in the startup world is very much focused on explicit value streams. Whereas a lot of what we're trying to do in ecosystems has to take into account intrinsic or internal value streams. Okay, I'm not going to go through this again. I think we're just about out of time.
Can you just give one example of a role just so something?
Well, maybe I'll ask someone in the audience who wants to give an example of a role and an ecosystem. So I heard lots of energy. Yeah, Christopher?
So obviously the government has a role in supporting civil society, but so do NGOs.
Mm-hmm.
And so do all of these voluntary organizations, ELPS in the United States, homeless shelters, et cetera, which is independent of the government. They're both trying to do. And then you also have sort of the citizen-oriented thing, the neighborhood watches or whatever. So three very different roles that are all supporting civil society.
And I would argue that they're very much role groups, because all of those roles you can break down to so many different types, right? If you look in the government, how many different roles are there, and what's the decision maker role? So it's a very complex picture you very quickly get into, right? And they all will have different drivers. The person who is head of for X, Y, and Z department in the government will have a different driver than maybe somebody who's more on the operational floor, right, et cetera, et cetera. But it's important to surface this up, and it's important to understand it. Then we're going to get a call that we have to move up. So I'm going to move on a little bit. Okay. So just keep in mind that this is one aspect. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So programs. This is one exercise within one program, within the wider context of what we do within startup landscape to help them on their journey, right? And hopefully we help someone with someone a successful path. We need to do the same in the ecosystem world. Some next steps to keep in mind. Hackathon homework. We started here. Do understand the roles that are going to be in your challenge you're involved in. Do understand the types of value that are out there. And make sure you discuss it with the various types of stakeholders. You will be at the hackathon exposed to all kinds of key stakeholders around each of the challenges. It is a unique opportunity to dive deep and to really validate your assumptions and your understanding of what are the roles and value streams in that ecosystem. That is a huge opportunity. Make sure you make the most of it. Do whatever homework you can beforehand. After the hackathon, of course, hackathon is one step on a journey towards the goal of realizing the ecosystem. It'll be a complex journey. And just to recap, large majority of startups fail despite established best practices and all kinds of incubators and all kinds of money flowing around. Ecosystems are much more complex, right? Creating new ecosystems is hard. It's very hard. Right? And I think there's a lot we can learn from startup incubation and how we can take those lessons to try and increase the chance of ecosystem success. If you're interested in brainstorming more with me and with Delft Digital Hub about how to drive ecosystem incubation forward, please come talk to me. Very interested to hear your comments. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Neil.